A man walks through a grove of olive trees in the dark. Ahead of him, torchlight moves between the trunks, and behind that light stand soldiers with drawn swords. He does not slow down. He walks straight toward the one he is looking for, and when he reaches him, he does the most ordinary thing in the world. He leans in and he kisses him on the cheek. That kiss is a signal. It tells the men with the swords which one to arrest. I is not a stranger to the man he betrays. He is not a hired soldier, and he is not an intruder who slipped past the gate. He is a friend. He is one of the 12 men closest to Jesus of Nazareth, one of the ones who left everything to follow, who ate at the same table, who slept under the same open sky. If you have ever been wounded by someone you trusted completely, if you have ever looked at your own heart and wondered how far it could drift, if you have ever been certain you knew a person and then watched them become someone you did not recognize, then you already know something about the man walking through those trees. 3 years he spent on the dusty roads of Galilee and Judea. 3 years eating from the same bowl, sleeping in the same camps, listening to every sermon, watching every miracle up close. And he carried the group's money in a bag at his side. His name was Judas, and in the centuries since, that name has become a single word in almost every language of the Western world, a word that means traitor. 30 pieces of silver. That is the number everyone remembers. It is stitched into the story, quoted in sermons, painted into 1,000 pictures. And almost everyone gets it wrong. Because when you hear 30 pieces of silver, you probably imagine a man selling his master for a fortune, a bag heavy with gold, a price worth a betrayal. But that is not what 30 pieces of silver was. In the law of Moses, 30 pieces of silver was the exact amount you paid a man when your ox gored his slave to death. It was the going rate for a dead servant, the cheapest human life the law bothered to put a number on. It was not a fortune, it was an insult. And that is the first clue that the money was never really the reason. Selling the Son of God for the price of a trampled slave would be like handing over everything you love for the smallest insurance payout on a life. The number is too small to be a motive, which means the real reason is hidden somewhere else, somewhere back down the road, in the 3 years before that kiss. That is what we are going to do. We are going to walk the whole road again, from the day Judas was chosen to the field that still carries his blood, and find out where the betrayal actually began. Let us start at the beginning. It begins, like everything in this story, with a choice, but not the choice you would expect. It begins with the choice Jesus made. Luke tells us that before Jesus picked his 12 closest followers, he went up on a mountain and prayed all night. And in the morning, when he came down, he called them one by one. Luke writes, in chapter 6, verse 13, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. And then, a few verses later, Luke lists them: Peter, Andrew, James, John, and at the very end of the list, verse 16, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Read that again slowly. Jesus chose him. Nobody forced Judas onto the list. He was not a mistake, not a stranger who wandered in. The same hands that reached out to heal the sick reached out and picked this man, on purpose, with his eyes open. In fact, John's gospel tells us Jesus knew. Long before the arrest, long before the silver, Jesus said to the 12, in chapter 6, verse 70, "Did I not choose you, the 12? And yet one of you is a devil." He said that early, years early, which raises a question that has haunted readers for 2,000 years. Why choose a man you know will turn on you? Hold on to that question. We will come back to it. Now, who was this man at the start? We actually know very little, and most of what we think we know is buried in his name, Judas Iscariot. Judas was one of the most common names a Jewish boy could have. It is simply the form of Judah, the name of a whole tribe of Israel. It means praised. But Iscariot is the strange part. The best guess among scholars is that it comes from a phrase, Ishkarioth, the man from Kerioth. And Kerioth was a town down in the south, in Judea. That one detail changes the whole picture, because every other man in that group came from up north, from Galilee. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Galileans, all of them. Judas was the outsider, the only southerner in a circle of northern fishermen, the one with a different accent, a different home, a different world behind him. There is a second theory about the name, and it is worth pausing on. Some scholars have connected Iscariot to a word that means dagger man. The Sicarii were a group of Jewish rebels the historian Josephus describes in chilling detail. nationalists who hid short curved knives under their cloaks, mixed into festival crowds, and stabbed their political enemies in broad daylight before vanishing into the mob. We cannot prove Judas was one of them. The text does not tell us. But if he was, or even if he simply shared their dream, it explains something. It means Judas may have signed up for a very particular kind of Messiah, a Messiah with a sword, a leader who would raise an army, drive out the Romans, and put Israel back on the throne. If that was the Messiah Judas came looking for, then he spent 3 years following a man who kept talking about turning the other cheek. And that gap between the king Judas wanted and the king Jesus was, may be the first crack in everything. And then there is this bag. Of all the 12 men, Judas is the one Jesus trusts with the money. Every gift, every donation, everything the little band lived on, Judas carried it in a pouch at his side. Think about what that means. In a group of 12, someone has to hold the purse, and the one they hand it to is Judas. He is trusted. He is inside. He is the treasurer. That is where he starts. Chosen, trusted, given the one thing you only give to someone you believe in. Remember that pouch. It is going to matter more than anyone at the table realized. For 3 years, nothing seems to go wrong. And that is exactly the problem. There is no dramatic falling out, no argument by a campfire, no moment where Judas storms off. He stays. He walks the roads, he hears the teaching, he watches the blind receive their sight, and the dead walk out of their graves. From the outside, he looks like all the others. But something is happening quietly, in the dark, where no one can see it. And John, who was there, tells us exactly what it was. Remember the bag, that pouch of money Judas carried. John lets us in on a secret about it. Speaking of a moment when Judas pretended to care about the poor, John writes, in chapter 12, verse 6, he said this, not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He had the money bag, and he used to help himself to what was put in it. Read that carefully, because it is easy to rush past. He used to help himself. Not once, not in a single desperate moment, over and over, as a habit. Judas had been skimming from the common purse for a long time, a little here, a little there, small enough that no one noticed, small enough that maybe he told himself it did not count. This is how betrayal actually works. It is almost never a single, sudden decision. It is a hairline crack in the foundation of a house, so thin you cannot even see it. And then 3 years later, the whole wall comes down, and everyone asks how it happened so fast. It did not happen fast. It had been happening the entire time. Judas did not wake up one morning a traitor. He became one the way anyone becomes one, by taking a little more than he should, and telling himself it was fine, until the taking had hollowed him out from the inside. And then comes the dinner that brings it all into the light. 6 days before Passover, Jesus is in the town of Bethany, in the home of friends. And a woman named Mary does something extravagant. She takes a jar of pure nard, an imported perfume worth about 300 denarii, which was nearly a full year's wages for a working man. And she pours the whole thing out on Jesus' feet, the entire jar. John says the house was filled with the fragrance. It is a moment of pure, reckless love. And Judas cannot stand it. He speaks up. John, chapter 12, verse 5. Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? On the surface, it sounds noble. It sounds like the most caring person in the room just spoke. And this is where we have to stop and correct something, because for centuries people have read this line and thought Judas simply cared about the wrong priorities. He did not. John tells us plainly, in the very next verse, that Judas said it because he was a thief and wanted the money in the bag where he could reach it. The tragedy is not that Judas valued the poor over Jesus. The tragedy is that he had learned to dress up his greed in the language of virtue. He could make theft sound like generosity. He could stand in a room full of worship and see only a missed opportunity to skim. And here is the detail that should stop us cold. John tells us this crack was already wide open before the last night ever came. He writes, in chapter 13, verse 2, the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray him. Already. Before the supper. Before the garden. The decision was not made in a flash of rage on the final night. It had been forming in the dark for a long, long time. So let us stop here for a moment and look at what we have seen. A man chosen by Jesus himself, trusted with the money. An outsider who may have wanted a very different kind of king. A quiet thief who learned to steal in small amounts and call it kindness. 4 threads, and every one of them was in place long before the silver ever changed hands. If this is helping you see Judas as more than a cardboard villain, if it is making the story land in a new way, then do something for us. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this with someone who thinks they already know how it ends. Because the next part is the one everyone thinks they understand, the number. And so we come to the number, the one everyone remembers. Somewhere in that final week, Judas makes his move. He goes to the chief priests, the religious authorities who already want Jesus dead, and he makes them an offer. Matthew records the scene, chapter 26, verse 15. Judas asks them, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" And Matthew writes, "And they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver." Now watch what Judas does. He does not demand a price. He asks them what they will give. He lets them set the number, and they hand him 30 pieces of silver. We already saw that this was a small sum, but now we can see just how small and just how deliberate, because that exact figure appears in the law of Moses, in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 32. If an ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall give their master 30 shekels of silver. That is the context. 30 pieces of silver was the compensation you paid when your animal killed someone's slave. It was the accountant's price of a dead servant. And the priests, whether they meant it as an insult or not, valued the Son of God at exactly that rate, the cheapest human life the law would name. But the number goes deeper still, because it had been written down centuries before as a prophecy. The prophet Zechariah, hundreds of years earlier, acted out a strange scene in which he played a shepherd and then asked to be paid off. And Zechariah writes, chapter 11, verse 12, "So they weighed out my wages, 30 pieces of silver." And then God tells him what to do with it, chapter 11, verse 13. "Throw it to the potter, the lordly price at which I was priced by them." 30 pieces of silver, thrown to a potter, written down 500 years before Judas was born. Hold that image of the potter in your mind. It is going to come back at the very end in a way that will make your skin prickle. And here we have to correct the second thing people get wrong about Judas. Because it is easy to read all of this, the chosen traitor, the thief, the prophecy written in advance, and conclude that Judas was simply a monster from the start, a pre-programmed villain with no real choice, a devil in a man's body who never had a chance. But that is not what the text shows us. Every step of the way, the door back stays open. Jesus keeps him close. Jesus washes his feet. Jesus, as we are about to see, hands him bread and calls him friend. If Judas were nothing but a machine built to betray, none of that would make sense. The horror of Judas is not that he was a monster. It is that he was a man with real chances to turn around, who chose again and again not to. So who was Judas really? We keep circling back to that name, Iscariot and the shadow of the Iscariot. Those dagger men Josephus wrote about, who slipped through festival crowds with knives under their cloaks and dreamed of a violent kingdom. Between roughly the 40s and the 60s after Christ, they would turn Jerusalem into a city where no one in a crowd was safe. We cannot say for certain Judas was one of them, but if that fire was in him, the hunger for a warrior Messiah who would break Rome, then imagine the slow disappointment of 3 years spent watching Jesus heal instead of conquer, forgive instead of fight, and finally talk about his own death instead of a throne. A man like that would not need much of a push. Just the right night, the right offer, and a heart already leaning away from the light. That night is almost here. Now the last night comes. It is Passover. Jesus is in an upper room with the 12 men who have followed him for 3 years, and Judas is there, reclining at the table with the rest. The silver already promised, the deal already struck in the dark. And Jesus knows. That is what makes this night almost unbearable to read. He knows what Judas has done, and he lets him stay for supper. Luke puts it starkly. Chapter 22, verse 3. Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. Of the number of the 12. Luke will not let us forget it. This is not an outsider. This is one of the inner circle, one of the men who dipped his bread in the same dish, and something dark has finally taken full hold of him. But watch what Jesus does with that knowledge. He does not expose Judas. He does not have him thrown out. Instead, John tells us, Jesus takes a piece of bread, dips it, and hands it directly to the one who is about to sell him. In that culture, handing someone a dipped morsel at a meal was a gesture of honor. the kind of thing a host did for an especially welcome guest. And Jesus gives it to Judas. John chapter 13, verse 26. It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it. He hands the bread of friendship to the man who has already betrayed him. And only then, John chapter 13, verse 27, does Jesus say quietly, "What you are going to do quickly." And here is the detail that has stopped readers cold for 2,000 years. John chapter 13, verse 30. So after receiving the morsel of bread, he immediately went out. And it was night. And it was night. John could have just said Judas left. Instead, he tells us it was dark outside. And every reader since has understood that he is not only talking about the hour. A man walks out of the light, holding a piece of bread given to him in love, and steps into the dark to go do the thing. Do you hear it? Jesus knew exactly who Judas was and what he was about to do, and still handed him the guest portion, still called him friend to his face. That is not the picture of a God waiting to catch you in your sin. That is the picture of someone who keeps the door open until the very last second, who reaches out to the one walking away, who will not stop offering his hand even to the man closing his fingers around the knife. Judas is not being hunted out of the room. He is being loved right up to the edge of the dark. And he walks into it anyway. The rest happens quickly. Judas leads a crowd back through the night, into the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus has gone to pray. And here is the last and strangest detail of all, the one from the very beginning of our story. Judas does not point. He does not shout a name. He walks up to Jesus and kisses him. Matthew chapter 26, verse 49. And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. The most tender gesture between friends turned into a weapon. A signal to the soldiers, this is the one. And Jesus, even now, does not curse him. Matthew chapter 26, verse 50. Friend, do what you came to do. Friend. Luke gives us the quiet, devastating question Jesus asks in that moment. Chapter 22, verse 48. Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss, not a shout, not a threat? A question with his name in it, asking him to see what he is doing while there is still a breath of time to stop. Judas does not answer. The soldiers close in. And the man who was chosen, trusted, and loved to the last disappears back into the dark he came from. He's no longer the treasurer. He's no longer the trusted insider. He's not even, anymore, a man who could turn back if he wanted to. Something is closed. But the story does not end in the garden, because something happens to Judas that almost no one expects. Matthew tells us that when Judas sees that Jesus has been condemned to die, something breaks in him. Chapter 27, verse 3. He changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver. He goes back to the priests, the coins in his hand, and he says the truest words he ever speaks. Matthew chapter 27, verse 4. I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And the priests give him the coldest answer in all of Scripture. What is that to us? See to it yourself. They used him, and now that he is broken, they have no use left for him. And then comes the sound. Matthew chapter 27, verse 5. And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed. Picture it. 30 coins hurled across a stone floor in the holy place, ringing and scattering and rolling into the corners, and a man walking out with empty hands. The money he thought he wanted, thrown away in horror. It was never about the money. It never had been. Matthew finishes the sentence. He departed, and he went and hanged himself. Now here's where we have to be honest, because the Bible gives us two different accounts of how Judas died, and I am not going to pretend they are simple to line up. Matthew says he hanged himself. But the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 18, says something else. Falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. Two pictures, a rope and a fall. So which was it? We do not know for certain. Scholars have offered honest attempts to fit them together. That Judas hanged himself and the rope or branch later broke, so that his body fell and burst on the ground below. There is even an early tradition from a writer named Papias around the year 100 that describes Judas dying in a very different, swollen, gruesome way. The plain truth is that the exact manner of his death is one of the places where the sources do not perfectly agree, and I would rather tell you that than pretend. But here is what every account agrees on, and what matters most. Judas died alone. He died in the grip of a remorse that ran toward a rope instead of running back to the one who called him friend. And the priest took his rejected silver, They would not put it in the treasury. Matthew chapter 27, verse 6. It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it is blood money. So instead, Matthew chapter 27, verse 7, they bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. The potter's field. Do you remember Zechariah, 500 years earlier? Throw it to the potter. The silver ends exactly where the prophecy said it would. And Acts chapter 1, verse 19 tells us that field got a name that has never left it, Akeldama, in their own language, the field of blood. To this day, there is a patch of ground outside Jerusalem that carries the memory of what that money bought. Now sit with the number one last time, 30 pieces of silver, the price of a dead slave. Because here is the echo you cannot unhear once you have heard it. Jesus was valued at the price of a slave. And then Jesus let himself be treated like one, stripped, beaten, sold, and led away to die a slave's death on a cross. The one who was beyond all price allowed himself to be handed over for the lowest number the law would name. He took the slave's price and the slave's death, and he paid it on purpose, so that the account every one of us owes could be marked paid in full. Judas threw the silver down and ran. Jesus picked up the whole debt and stayed. So what do we carry out of this? First, the plain truth of it. Betrayal is almost never one big decision. It is 100 small ones that no one sees. A little skimmed from the bag, a little dishonesty dressed as virtue, a heart leaning a few degrees away from the light, year after year, until one night the whole wall comes down. Judas did not fall in an evening. He drifted for 3 years, and the evening only showed what the years had already done. Second, what that means for us. Nearness to holy things does not change a heart by itself. Judas heard every sermon Jesus preached. He saw the dead raised with his own eyes. He held the money and ate from the bowl and watched the light up close for 3 years, and none of it reached the place where he actually lived. You can sit close to the fire your whole life and still choose to stay cold. What changes a heart is not proximity, it is surrender. And that is a choice only you can make about your own. And third, the one that should stay with you longest. In the garden, at the very end, with the soldiers closing in, and the kiss still warm on his cheek, Jesus looked at the man who sold him and said one word, friend. The door back was open even then. It did not close because of what Judas had done. Peter denied Jesus that same night and was forgiven and restored. It closed because Judas would not turn around and walk through it, and that is the difference between the two men. Not the size of the sin, the direction they ran afterward. So hear this, if you hear nothing else. Whatever you have done, however far down the road you think you have gone, the door is not closed by your failure. It is only closed by refusing to come back. Your last chapter does not have to be the field of blood. We have walked the whole road, the choosing, the bag, the perfume, the silver, the bread, the kiss, and the field. If this changed the way you see one of the most famous stories in the world, help us reach someone else with it. Subscribe, leave a comment with the part that struck you hardest, and share this with a friend who thinks they already know why Judas did it. Thank you for walking it with us, and may you always have the courage to turn around, no matter how dark the night, and walk back toward the one still calling you friend.